Hello, welcome, and thanks for joining me for another book chat. Today, let's spend a few minutes with Empires of the Silk Road, a history of Central Asia from the Bronze Age to the present by Christopher I Beckwith. This work of non-fiction was originally published back in 2009. This is a history. This was published by one of the great university presses, Princeton University Press. And this paperback edition, I'm not sure where I picked this up actually. I've had this on my shelf to read for quite a while, but I really love these general histories of Central Asia because I really find this region fascinating, especially going way back in time, which this really begins with the Bronze Age, a little bit sooner if we're going to talk about the Indo-European speaking people, but we'll get to that. So why I read this, so like I said, I really love these general histories. I have previously chatted two similar histories. One is called The Horse, the Wheel, and Language by David W. Anthony, and the other one's called By Steppe, Desert and Ocean, The Birth of Eurasia by Barry Cunliffe, and I have chats on both of those, so I will link to those chats down in the details below if you're interested in checking those out. But this particular general history, like I said, I've had it on my shelf to read for quite a while, and I'm finally getting around to doing it, and I did enjoy it really quite a bit. So how I thought I would present this, needless to say, we're talking about a lot of history packed into, I think there's about, there's a lot of notes in it. So the book itself had around 400 pages, and then a bunch of endnotes and bibliography and such. But there's a lot of history in here. So what I thought I would do is just take out some of the key concepts that I took away from reading the book and sort of chat about them that are mentioned in the book. So the first of these big concepts that are in the book really is about the Indo-European people, or the Proto IndoEuropean speaking people, I should say. This is all about a language. This language, these people that spoke this Proto IndoEuropean language way back in the recesses of time, were in Central Asia, and their language spread all over Asia, Eurasia. So from Europe to China, their language is the root of many, many, many languages, including English, and almost all of the languages of Europe, actually, as well as Persia, India, some from parts of what's now China. So the language has been very influential, as has the culture. And this movement of the Proto-Indo-European people and their when they took their language, it occurred in different sort of waves, and the book goes into that. So that's kind of a good basis for how this culture spread, because another really important concept is the cultural, in the book it's called the Eurasian Cultural Complex. And this is about the beliefs and sort of the culture of these Proto-Indo-European peoples. So we don't actually know what the culture was, but we can tell a lot about the culture from its language, and also the commonality of myths throughout these regions where they migrated and took their language. They took also aspects of their culture, and so part of their culture was a sort of a warrior culture. And so one really central feature of it was a founding myth. And so this founding myth, it really sounds familiar if you know the founding myth of Rome. This is sort of it's a legacy of the Central Eurasian cultural complex, where there's a hero figure who is nourished by a wolf. This is a myth that occurs through many, many cultures. And so another aspect of this culture is a sort of a warrior culture where there's a leader who's really sort of the main, I guess, warrior, and he's surrounded by a very devoted circle of other warriors that's called a comitatus. And this feature also spread all through Eurasia. When I say Eurasia, I'm talking about from basically Ireland to Japan. So, and all the way up from Russia, the Arctic, all the way down to India and the Indian Ocean. So that whole big continent as one giant continent, and the spread of this culture and the spread of these ideas all throughout that whole continent. So anyway, this comitatus, it actually went on to influence, the book goes into things like the medieval feudalism, where there was a lord and then his vassals. This is sort of a legacy of the comment of this Central Eurasian cultural complex. It lasted a really long time in history. It started to sort of break up with the rise of the world religions, so Buddhism, Christianity, Islam, Judaism. The Central Eurasian peoples eventually adopted one or the other of these world religions, and with the adoption of the world religions, their belief systems, started to shift and change. But it lasted a really long time, and it mutated into several different forms throughout time. So to me, that was really fascinating. So another idea that's talked about a lot in this book is the Silk Road. So, it's in the title, The Silk Road. So I think for me, I was expecting this book to be about that road that, so in my mind, which is an American mind of the 21st century, the Silk Road was this sort of a pipeline. You think of it as a pipeline of running from China, taking luxury goods from China like silk and spices and things like this, through this long and dangerous journey with these caravans and oasis cities. It all sounds really exotic, and then it winds up, in Rome or Europe. And so that, to me, that's the idea of the Silk Road, and that's actually not really an accurate, I don't think, portrayal of what's meant by the Silk Road here. He's talking about the Silk Road economy, and that is the interaction between all of the cultures of Central Eurasia and their interaction, and then their interaction with the periphery. And the periphery is, when we say periphery, we're talking basically Europe, China, India, Persia, the edges, eventually Russia. And so throughout most of history, actually, there's the Silk Road economy that's talked about in this book is it's not just passing through Central Asia, it's actually radiating out of Central Asia a lot of times into the periphery, and then from the periphery back into Central Asia. So it's truly like a continental economy that's running. So I thought it'd be kind of cool to see a map that's in the book. There's a couple of different maps. There's a modern map of Eurasia, and then there's this pre-modern map of Eurasia. So just to get a grasp of the scope of what we're talking about. So over here is Europe. This is Spain right here. This is the British Isles right here. So Europe's up here, and then over here is Japan. So, this whole area, and then down here, India here, this whole area here is Eurasia itself. So this is what the book's concerning. But anyway, that Silk Road, idea of the Silk Road as being way more than just this pipeline of luxury goods. It was way more complicated, and they were way more interdependent than I realized. So barbarians, another concept that is brought up in this book that's a misconception, I think, to a lot of people, including myself, of the Central Asians as these barbarians. And the reason why we think of them as barbarians, we're talking about the Huns, the Central Asian Huns, the Mongols. Europeans have this view of them as barbarians, and so do the Chinese. And this is because of their conflicts that they had with them. And so they got sort of judged to be barbarians. And most of our sources, historical sources, a lot of our sources anyway, will call them barbarians or consider them barbarians, violent, warlike. The book goes into great pains to show us, though, historically, in the actual historical record, that they're actually not that violent. They're not any more violent or warlike than the periphery cultures, like European cultures or Chinese cultures or Persian cultures. So I thought that was really, really super interesting. So, the book also talks about, because we go through time, we actually come to the modern day, and it talks about the demise of the Silk Road. And so how the Silk Road came to an end ultimately was the rise of the periphery. And this happened really because of Portugal, had that route, discovered the route around Africa to get to the Orient, by sea. And so the Central Eurasian economies could be bypassed. And then with the rise of Russia, China, and Europe, sort of boxed them in, and also Persia, Iran, and India down in the south, sort of boxed them in. And as the peripheral states became more wealthy, then they didn't rely. It sort of destroyed actually the economy of Central Asia, and they've yet to recover. The author makes a point to mention. So what else? A couple of other thoughts about the book. So, how Eurasia came to be so powerful. One thing I've always been fascinated about with Eurasia is how did Eurasia become such a driving force in world history? It's the area that had the first really big civilizations, the first sort of big economies, like I've mentioned. So, how did that happen? And the book sort of explains this as a instance where there's a lot of cross-fertilization. So if one region is in a repressive sort of phase where they're suppressing knowledge or they're suppressing advancement, then those people who are trying to further progress or advancement or whatever can go to a neighboring empire, and this happened all the time, exchanging ideas and exchanging people. So as one would suppress some idea, it could flourish elsewhere because some other place in Eurasia would welcome it. So that sort of cross fertilization really helped to, I think, according to the book, sort of promote Eurasian, advancement within Eurasia. So I think that really was really enlightening. And then before I run out of time, the author does spend a lot of time on modernism, sort of the 20th century modernism and the destruction that has wreaked, especially in Central Asia, where the Central Asians became ultimately to be completely dominated by either the Europeans, the Russians, or the Chinese in the 20th century, and how they've had, because of modernism, modernism demands a break with the past in a lot of ways, and so this has separated the peoples of Central Asia largely because they were powerless to stop it from their past. And a case in point is Tibet. He spends quite a bit of time talking about Tibet, controlled by China currently. So to me that was also really super interesting. So yeah, the book was just really fascinating. It was actually, for 400 pages of this kind of history, it was actually a fairly quick read for me, and I really enjoyed it. I thought I would read a poem, but I don't think I'm going to be able to find it. Oh, yeah, I am. I'll close with this poem. This is by Charles Baudelaire. The poem's called Composure. And the poem says, "See the bygone years leaning on the balconies of heaven in old-fashioned clothes, surging from the water's depths, regret smiling, the dying sun falling asleep under an arch. And like a long shroud trailing off to the orient, listen, my dearest, listen, the sweet night who walks." I love that. I think it's so beautiful. See the bygone years leaning on the balconies of heaven in old-fashioned clothes. So cool. Empires of the Silk Road. Enjoyed it a lot. So my next book chat is going to be Descent into Hell by Charles Williams. This is a theological thriller from 1937. So it's really interesting. It's a little dense, but we'll get into it in the next book chat. So stay tuned for that. Until next time, take care. Bye.